Just one hug. That's all she begged for. As she stood on the precipice of childbirth, a terrifying, life-altering moment, all Ilara wanted was the reassurance of her husband's arms. But Julian, the man who had vowed to love and protect her, was busy. A critical business dinner, he claimed. But what if that business dinner was a lie? What if the client was a woman she knew intimately, and their merger was a betrayal that would shatter her world forever? Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story of a missed hug. It's a tale of unimaginable deceit. The scent of rain-soaked earth and old money clung to the air in their palatial home, a sprawling mansion nestled in the heart of Bel Air. From the outside, it was a fortress of success, a testament to Julian Vance's Midas touch in the cutthroat world of finance. Inside, however, it was a gilded cage for Ilara, his wife of 5 years. The silence in the cavernous rooms was a constant, oppressive weight, broken only by the ticking of a ridiculously oversized grandfather clock in the foyer, a sound that seemed to mock the slow, agonizing crawl of her pregnancy. Ilara had always been a woman of simple tastes, a stark contrast to the opulence Julian reveled in. She'd fallen for the man, not his millions. She had seen a flicker of warmth in his eyes back then, a promise of a shared life that had slowly been extinguished by the relentless pursuit of more. More wealth, more power, more everything that wasn't her. Her pregnancy had been a difficult one, a high-risk journey fraught with complications that had confined her to the house for the better part of 7 months. Each day was a monotonous cycle of solitude, her only companions, the hired staff, who moved about with a practiced impersonal efficiency. Julian was a ghost in their own home, a fleeting presence in the mornings and a weary sigh late at night. His excuse was always the same: work, a multi-billion-dollar merger with a Japanese tech giant, a deal that would cement his legacy. "For us, Ilara," he'd say, his voice a low, tired murmur. "For the baby." But the baby, a tiny life growing within her, felt more like hers alone. She'd talk to him for hours, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, her voice a soft whisper in the lonely expanse of their bedroom. She'd chosen a name, Liam, a name that felt strong and kind, everything she hoped her son would be, everything Julian was not. The due date was a week away, but her doctor had warned that the baby could come at any time. A knot of anxiety was a permanent resident in her chest. She yearned for Julian's presence, not just his physical body in the same house, but his attention, his affection. She craved the man she had married, the one who would hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay. That evening, a wave of Braxton Hicks contractions, stronger than any she'd felt before, sent a jolt of alarm through her. They were irregular, but they were a stark reminder of the impending reality of childbirth. She found Julian in his study, the room a shrine to his success. Awards and accolades lined the mahogany shelves, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and ambition. He was on the phone, his back to her, his voice sharp and commanding. He was closing a deal, always closing a deal. She weighted her hand on her belly, the false contractions making her breath hitch. When he finally hung up, he turned, his eyes briefly registering her presence before flicking to the stack of papers on his desk. "Julian," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Not now, Ilara," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm in the middle of something." "It's the baby," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm having contractions." He looked up, then a flicker of annoyance in his gaze. The doctor said it's normal. Braxton Hicks, right? You're not due for another week. I know, but they feel different this time. Stronger. I'm scared, Julian. She took a tentative step towards him, her arms wrapping around her swollen belly. Could you just hold me for a minute? Just a hug. It was a simple request, a desperate plea for connection from a woman on the verge of the most profound experience of her life. She saw him hesitate, his jaw tightening. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of the old Julian, the man who would have swept her into his arms without a second thought. But then the moment was gone, replaced by the cool, calculating CEO. He sighed a sound of pure exasperation and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Elara, I can't," he said, his voice laced with an impatience that cut her deeper than any knife. "I have a business dinner tonight. It's crucial. The final negotiations for the merger. I've been working on this for months. I can't just drop everything." A business dinner. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Of course, a business dinner was more important than his terrified, pregnant wife. "A business dinner," she repeated, her voice incredulous. "Julian, I could be in labor. I need you here." "Don't be dramatic," he snapped, his voice rising. "It's not real labor. The doctor said you'd know. I'll call you as soon as the dinner is over. We'll go to the hospital then, if you're still feeling whatever it is you're feeling." He turned away from her, then dismissing her fears, her needs, with a casual wave of his hand. He straightened his tie, a custom-made silk creation from a designer she couldn't even pronounce, and grabbed his briefcase. As he walked past her, he didn't even glance in her direction. The front door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the silent mansion, a final definitive punctuation mark on his abandonment. Elara stood there for a long time, the phantom pains in her belly mingling with the very real ache in her heart. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She had never felt so alone. As the hours ticked by, the contractions intensified their rhythm, becoming more regular, more insistent. The pain was a living thing, coiling and uncoiling within her. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was it. This was real labor. She called Julian, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the phone. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again and again, each unanswered call a fresh wave of despair. He was at his important business dinner, a dinner that was apparently more important than the birth of his own child. With a surge of adrenaline born of fear and a primal need to protect her baby, she called her doctor, her voice a strained whisper. The doctor's calm, professional voice on the other end of the line was a lifeline in the storm of her pain and terror. "I need you to come to the hospital immediately, Elara," the doctor said, her tone gentle but firm. "I'll meet you there." Elara then called for a taxi, her voice cracking as she gave the address. The thought of arriving at the hospital alone, of going through labor without the one person who was supposed to be her rock, was a fresh hell she hadn't anticipated. As she waited for the taxi, a sudden, inexplicable urge washed over her. It was a foolish, desperate impulse, but she couldn't ignore it. She had to know. She had to see for herself what this business dinner was that was so much more important than her. She remembered Julian mentioning the name of the restaurant, a trendy new place downtown called Serafina's, a name that now sounded like a bitter irony. With a determination she didn't know she possessed, she hobbled to the garage, her body screaming in protest. She slid into her own car, a modest sedan that Julian had always derided as unbefitting of her station, and pulled out of the driveway, her destination not the hospital, but a place that would either confirm her deepest fears or offer a sliver of hope she wasn't sure she still had. The drive was a blur of pain and tears. Each contraction was a white-hot agony that stole her breath and blurred her vision. She drove on autopilot, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and a desperate need for the truth. When she arrived at Serafina's, the valet gave her a look of pity and concern, but she ignored him, her eyes fixed on the restaurant's glittering facade. She walked through the doors, her hand on her belly, her every step a monumental effort. The restaurant was a sea of hushed conversations and clinking glasses. She scanned the room, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. And then she saw him, Julian. He was seated at a secluded table in the corner, his back to her. He was leaning in close to his dinner companion, his voice a low, intimate murmur. A bottle of expensive champagne sat in a silver bucket between them, and the candlelight cast a soft, romantic glow on their faces. And then his companion laughed, a sound that was both musical and utterly devastatingly familiar. The woman turned her head slightly, and in that moment, Ilara's world shattered. It wasn't a business associate, it wasn't a client, it was her sister, her younger sister, Isabella, the woman she had confided in, the one she had trusted implicitly, the woman who had held her hand and told her she deserved better than Julian's neglect, all the while plotting her own betrayal. The sight of them together, so intimate, so comfortable, so utterly oblivious to the world of pain she was in, was a blow more visceral than any contraction. The air was sucked from her lungs, and a strangled sob escaped her lips. At that moment, as if sensing her presence, Julian turned. His eyes met hers across the crowded restaurant, and the color drained from his face. The charming smile he had been bestowing on Isabella vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. And in that instant, another contraction, more powerful than any before, ripped through her. Her water broke a warm gush that soaked through her dress and pooled at her feet. She cried out, a sound of pure agony that cut through the restaurant's genteel hum. All eyes turned to her, a sea of curious, startled faces. But Ilara only had eyes for one person, her husband, the man who was busy with a business dinner, with her sister, the ultimate betrayal. And as the darkness threatened to consume her, as the pain became unbearable, she had only one thought: she was utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone. The life she had known was a lie, and the future she had envisioned was a cruel, impossible dream. The only thing that was real was the tiny life fighting to be born, a life she would have to bring into this world on her own. A world that had suddenly become a very, very cold place. The chaos that erupted in Serafina's was a surreal backdrop to the implosion of Ilara's world. The hushed whispers and clinking glasses of a moment before were replaced by a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and the frantic shuffling of staff. But for Ilara, it was all a distant hum, a muffled soundtrack to the roaring in her ears. Her universe had narrowed to two faces: Julian's frozen in a mask of horror and guilt, and Isabella's a canvas of wide-eyed panic. Isabella, her baby sister, the one who had held her hand just last week, feigning sympathy as Ilara cried about Julian's growing distance. "You deserve so much better, Ellie," she had cooed, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. "He doesn't appreciate you." The memory was a shard of glass, twisting in Ilara's gut. The betrayal wasn't just Julian's, it was a dual-pronged dagger, one blade wielded by her husband, the other by her own flesh and blood. Pain, sharp and relentless, sliced through her, bringing her back to the horrifying present. The contraction was a monstrous wave lifting her and slamming her down. She doubled over, a guttural cry tearing from her throat, her hands instinctively clutching her belly. Her water, a public testament to her body's primal, unstoppable journey, continued to pool on the polished marble floor. Julian was on his feet now, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He started towards her, his face a jumble of emotions, shock, fear, and a desperate, pathetic attempt at damage control. "Elara," he began, his voice a strangled whisper, "what are you doing here?" The sheer audacity of the question was a slap in the face. "What am I doing here?" she repeated, her voice rising with a hysterical edge. "I'm in labor, Julian. I'm having our baby. The one you were too busy to be there for." Her shout silenced the restaurant. Every eye was on them, a captive audience to their real-life soap opera. Isabella, a deer in the headlights, remained frozen in her seat, her perfectly made-up face pale and drawn. She looked from Elara to Julian, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Let's go," Julian said, reaching for Elara's arm. His touch felt like a brand, and she recoiled as if burned. "Don't you touch me!" she shrieked, her voice raw with pain and fury. "Don't you ever touch me again!" Another contraction seized her, this one even more brutal than the last. She cried out, stumbling backward, her hand catching the edge of a nearby table to steady herself. A waiter, a young man, with kind, panicked eyes, rushed to her side, offering his arm. "Ma'am, are you all right? Should I call an ambulance?" "Yes," she gasped, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Please, the hospital, Cedars Sinai." She named the renowned medical center, a place synonymous with the best care, a place Julian had insisted on, another hollow gesture of his supposed devotion. Julian, seeing the situation spiraling out of his control, became more insistent. "Elara, stop this. We'll go together. Just let me handle this." He was trying to regain his composure to project the image of the capable, in-charge husband. But the mask was slipping, revealing the craven, deceitful man beneath. "Handle this," Elara laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that echoed in the cavernous restaurant. "You mean handle her?" She pointed a trembling finger at Isabella, who flinched as if struck. Was this part of the merger, Julian? A new kind of business partnership? The venom in her words hit their mark. Julian paled, and Isabella finally broke her silence, her voice a pathetic whimper. "Elara, it's not what you think." "Oh, I think it's exactly what I think." Elara spat back, the pain momentarily forgotten, replaced by a white-hot rage. "How long, Isabella? How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" The direct question hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Isabella couldn't meet her gaze, her eyes darting around the room, anywhere but at the sister she had so thoroughly betrayed. Her silence was a confession more damning than any words could be. The paramedics arrived then, a whirlwind of calm, professional efficiency in the midst of the emotional carnage. They moved towards Elara, their voices soothing and steady. As they began to assess her, Julian made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "I'm her husband," he said, puffing out his chest, trying to assert his authority. "I'll ride with her in the ambulance." One of the paramedics, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, gave him a curt nod. "Fine, but we need to move. Now." They helped Elara onto a gurney, the movement jarring, sending fresh waves of pain through her. As they wheeled her towards the exit, her eyes locked with Isabella's one last time. There was no remorse in her sister's eyes, only a flicker of something that looked like triumph, quickly masked by a facade of distress. The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights and screaming sirens, a fitting soundtrack to the chaos in her mind. Julian sat beside her, his hand hovering over hers, a hesitant, uncertain gesture. He kept murmuring her name, a litany of, "Elara, I'm so sorry, and we can fix this." But his words were meaningless, hollow echoes in the face of his monumental betrayal. She turned her head away from him, a single tear tracing a path through the sweat on her temple. She was in the throes of the most physically demanding experience of her life, and yet the pain in her heart was a far greater agony. At Cedars Sinai, she was whisked away to a private delivery suite, a room that Julian had undoubtedly paid a premium for. Nurses and doctors swarmed around her, their voices a comforting professional hum. They hooked her up to monitors, their practiced hands a stark contrast to Julian's useless, hovering presence. He tried to play the part of the concerned husband, asking the medical staff questions, attempting to hold her hand. But she was a statue, cold and unresponsive. She answered the doctor's questions in a clipped monotone, her focus turned inward on the baby she was about to bring into this broken world. The labor was long and arduous, a grueling marathon of pain and exhaustion. Through it all, Julian remained in the room, a silent, ghostly presence. He was a constant reminder of the life that had been a lie, the love that had been a sham. At one point, during a particularly excruciating contraction, she screamed a sound of pure animalistic agony. Julian rushed to her side, his face a mask of concern. "Elara, I'm here. I'm right here." She opened her eyes, her vision blurred with sweat and tears, and looked at him. "I wish you weren't," she said, her voice a low, guttural whisper. "I wish it was anyone but you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He recoiled, his face ashen. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply stood there, a pathetic, broken man, in the face of the destruction he had wrought. Hours later, after a final monumental push, her son was born. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over her. He was here. He was safe. The doctor placed the crying, squirming baby on her chest, and in that moment, the world outside the two of them ceased to exist. She looked at his tiny, perfect face, his dark hair plastered to his head, his eyes squeezed shut. He was beautiful. He was hers. She named him Liam, the name she had chosen in her lonely solitude, a name that now felt like a shield, a promise of a better future. Julian, who had been watching from the corner of the room, took a tentative step forward. He's beautiful, Elara." She didn't look at him. She didn't acknowledge his presence. Her entire world was this tiny, precious baby in her arms. Can I hold him?" Julian asked, his voice thick with unshed tears. Elara finally looked up at him, then her gaze cold and hard. "No," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You can't." She then turned to the nurse, who was standing nearby. "Could you please ask him to leave?" she said, her voice calm and steady. "I'd like to be alone with my son." The nurse, who had witnessed the silent, frigid drama that had played out in the delivery room, gave a sympathetic nod. She turned to Julian, her expression professional but firm. "Sir, I think it would be best if you gave them some space." Julian looked from the nurse to Elara, his face a canvas of desperation. "Elara, please," he begged. "He's my son too. You lost that right tonight," she said, her voice as sharp as a shard of glass. "You lost the right to be his father when you chose to be with my sister instead of with me." The finality in her tone was unmistakable. Defeated, Julian turned and walked out of the room, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alara could breathe. She looked down at Liam, who had quieted in her arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger. A fierce, protective love stronger than any pain she had ever known surged through her. She was a mother now, and she would protect her son from the wreckage of his father's betrayal, no matter what it took. The road ahead was uncertain, a daunting, uncharted territory. But as she held her son, she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she was not alone anymore. She had Liam. And together, they would build a new life, a life free from the lies and deceit of the past, a life that was truly their own. The first few days in the sterile quiet of the hospital room were a strange, surreal limbo. The world outside, with its shattered relationships and devastating truths, felt a million miles away. Alara's universe had shrunk to the dimensions of the hospital bed, her focus solely on the tiny, warm bundle in her arms. Liam, her son. He was her anchor in the churning sea of her emotions, his every whimper, every sigh, a grounding force. The nurses at Cedars Sinai were her silent saviors. They moved with a gentle efficiency, teaching her how to swaddle, how to nurse, how to navigate the terrifying, beautiful new world of motherhood. They spoke in hushed, respectful tones, their eyes holding a deep, unspoken sympathy. The story of the dramatic arrival at Serafina's had undoubtedly spread like wildfire through the hospital grapevine. They knew, and their kindness was a balm on her raw, wounded spirit. Julian had tried to see her again. He had sent flowers, extravagant bouquets of roses and lilies that filled the room with a cloying, funereal scent. Alara had them immediately removed. He had sent text messages, long, rambling pleas for forgiveness, filled with promises to change, to make it all up to her. She deleted them without reading past the first few words. He had even tried to come to the room, but Alara had given the nurses strict instructions. He was not to be allowed in, under any circumstances. Her lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Catherine, had been her only other visitor. Alara had called her from the hospital, her voice still weak but resolute. She had laid out the facts, her tone devoid of the hysteria and pain she felt. The business dinner, the betrayal, Isabella. Catherine had listened in silence, her only interjection a low, "The bastard." When Alara was finished, Catherine's voice was firm, professional, and reassuringly ruthless. "We're going to take him for everything he's worth, Alara, and then some." The legal machinery was already in motion. The prenuptial agreement, which had once seemed like a cold, cynical document, was now her shield. Catherine was poring over every clause, every loophole, looking for a way to turn Julian's infidelity into a weapon. But the legal battle was a distant concern. The more immediate, more painful battle was the one raging within her. The nights were the hardest. When Liam was asleep in his bassinet beside her bed, the silence of the room would amplify the turmoil in her mind. The image of Julian and Isabella at that candlelit table would flash behind her eyelids, a recurring, torturous scene. The laughter, the intimacy, the casual way Julian had rested his hand on her sister's arm. It was a betrayal so profound, so personal, it felt like a physical violation. Isabella. The thought of her sister was a fresh wave of nausea. She had tried to contact Alara, a barrage of tearful voicemails and frantic texts. "Ellie, please, you have to let me explain." One message had pleaded. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Alara had listened to that one message, a morbid curiosity compelling her to press play. The sound of her sister's voice, so familiar, yet now so alien, had sent a fresh wave of rage and grief through her. She had blocked Isabella's number immediately after. There was nothing to explain. The image of her sister with her husband was an explanation in itself. Her parents had called their voices a mixture of confusion and concern. They had heard from a frantic Isabella that something was wrong, that Alara wasn't speaking to her. Alara, not wanting to shatter their world over the phone, had been vague. "There's been a disagreement," she had said, her voice tight. "I'll explain everything when I'm home." The thought of that conversation, of telling her parents that their two daughters were now bitter enemies, was a heavy, dread-filled weight on her chest. On the day of her discharge from the hospital, a new wave of anxiety washed over her. The hospital had been a sanctuary, a protected bubble. Now she had to return to the house, to the gilded cage, that was now a monument to her broken marriage. She had arranged for a car service, refusing to let Julian take her home. As she was getting ready to leave, a nurse came in with a final set of discharge papers. "Mr. Vance has taken care of the entire bill," the nurse said, her voice gentle, "and he's arranged for a full-time baby nurse to be at the house for you." The news was a mix of relief and resentment. She needed the help, she knew that. But the thought of it being Julian's arrangement, another attempt to buy his way back into her good graces, was galling. Still, she was too exhausted to argue. She would take the help for Liam's sake. The ride home was silent, the city of Los Angeles, a blur outside the tinted windows. As the car turned onto the long, winding driveway of their Bel Air mansion, her heart began to pound. The house, which had once represented security and success, now looked like a mausoleum. When she walked through the front door, Liam cradled in her arms, the first thing she saw was Julian. He was standing in the foyer, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red-rimmed. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Alara," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're home." She didn't respond. She walked past him, her gaze fixed straight ahead, and started up the grand staircase towards the nursery. "I had the nursery completely redone," he called after her, his voice desperate. "I had it soundproofed, and there's a new air filtration system, the best of everything, for Liam." She paused on the stairs, her back to him. The best of everything. That was always his solution. Throw money at the problem until it went away. "You can't buy your way out of this, Julian," she said, her voice cold and even. "You can't buy a new life. You can't buy a new family." She continued up the stairs, leaving him standing alone in the cavernous foyer, a king in his empty castle. The baby nurse, a kind-faced woman named Maria, was waiting for her in the nursery. The room was indeed perfect, a serene oasis of soft blues and creams, but it felt sterile, impersonal. It was Julian's creation, not theirs. Over the next few days, they fell into a strange, strained routine. Alara spent all her time in the nursery, with Liam creating a small, self-contained world for the two of them. Maria was a godsend, handling the night feeds and allowing Alara to get some much-needed rest. Julian was a ghost in his own home. He would leave for work before she woke up and return long after she had retreated to her room for the night. The only evidence of his presence was the faint scent of his expensive cologne in the hallway, a scent that now made her stomach churn. One evening, about a week after she had returned home, she was in the nursery rocking a fussy Liam when Julian appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, just watching them, his face a mask of longing and regret. "He looks like you," he said softly. "He has your eyes." Alara didn't answer, her focus entirely on her son. "Elara, please," he said, taking a tentative step into the room. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her voice flat. "My lawyer will be in touch with yours." "I don't want the lawyers," he said, his voice cracking. "I want my wife. I want my family." "You should have thought of that before you took my sister to Serafina's," she said, her voice sharp. He flinched, the name of the restaurant a physical blow. "It was a mistake, Elara," he said, his voice pleading. "A terrible, stupid mistake. It meant nothing." "It meant everything," she said, her voice rising. "It meant that every 'I love you,' every promise, every single moment of our marriage was a lie. You didn't just cheat on me, Julian. You cheated on me with my sister, the one person in the world I thought I could trust." "I know," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you." "There is no making it up," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "There is only this." She looked down at Liam, her expression softening for a moment before hardening again as she looked back at Julian. "He is all that matters now, and I will not have him raised in a house built on lies and betrayal." She stood up then, holding Liam close to her chest. "I want you to leave," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "I want you to pack your bags and get out of this house." Julian stared at her, his face a picture of disbelief. "Elara, this is my house, and this is my son," she countered, her voice unwavering, "and I will not have him grow up with you as his role model. So you can either leave on your own, or I will have you legally removed. Your choice." The finality in her voice, the steel in her gaze, finally seemed to penetrate his denial. He looked from her to the baby in her arms, and a look of utter desolation crossed his face. He had lost. He had lost everything. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the nursery, his footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors as he went to his own room to pack. Elara stood there listening to the sounds of his departure, a strange mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her. It was over. Her marriage was over. Her old life was over. She looked down at Liam, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. A single tear escaped her eye and fell onto his cheek. He stirred for a moment, then settled back into a deep sleep. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you, I will be enough." She knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be legal battles, emotional turmoil, and the daunting task of rebuilding her life from the ashes of her husband's betrayal. But as she held her son, she felt a strength she never knew she possessed. She was a mother, and for Liam, she would be a warrior. The fight for their future had just begun. The days that followed Julian's departure were a strange and unsettling blend of liberation and loss. The vast, echoing silence of the Bel Air mansion was no longer oppressive. It was a canvas on which Elara could begin to paint a new life. The scent of Julian's cologne faded, replaced by the gentle, comforting aroma of baby powder and milk. The house began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a sanctuary, a fortress she was building around herself and her son. But the ghost of Julian and the even more painful specter of her sister's betrayal lingered in the shadows. Every corner of the house held a memory, a reminder of the life that had been so cruelly snatched away from her. The grand dining room where they had hosted lavish dinner parties, the home theater where they had watched movies on lazy Sunday afternoons, the master bedroom with its panoramic views of the city. All were now tainted with the bitter taste of deceit. Elara found herself retreating further and further into the nursery, the one room that felt truly hers and Liam's. With Maria's help, she created a predictable, soothing rhythm to their days. Feedings, naps, quiet moments of cuddling and cooing. These were the anchors that kept her from being swept away by the undertow of her grief. Her lawyer, Catherine, was a formidable presence in the background, a whirlwind of legal filings and aggressive negotiations. "He's trying to play hardball," Catherine had told her during one of their daily phone calls. "He's offering a settlement, but it's an insult. He thinks he can buy his way out of this with a fraction of what you're entitled to." "I don't care about the money," Alara had said, her voice tired. "I just want this to be over." "No," Catherine had countered, her voice sharp. "You will care. You'll care when you're raising Liam on your own, when you're paying for his education, when you're building a new life for yourself. This isn't just about money, Alara. It's about justice. It's about making him pay for what he did." Catherine's words were a harsh but necessary reminder of the practical realities of her situation. She was no longer the wife of a billionaire. She was a single mother, and she needed to be pragmatic. She gave Catherine the go-ahead to fight, to be as ruthless as necessary. The most difficult battle, however, was the one she had to fight with her own family. A week after Julian had left, her parents had shown up at the house, their faces etched with worry. They had been bombarded with frantic, tearful calls from Isabella, who had painted a picture of a distraught, irrational Alara who was shutting everyone out. Alara had met them in the formal living room, a room she had always hated for its stiff, impersonal opulence. She held Liam in her arms, a tiny living shield. "What is going on, Alara?" her father had asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Isabella is worried sick. She says you won't talk to her." Alara took a deep breath, the moment she had been dreading finally upon her. "I'm not talking to her," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And I have no intention of ever talking to her again." Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Alara, what are you saying? She's your sister." "She stopped being my sister the night she had dinner with my husband," Alara said, her voice flat. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Her parents stared at her, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. And so Alara told them. She laid out the entire sordid story, from Julian's business dinner to the scene at Serafina's to the final devastating confirmation of the affair. She spoke in a calm, measured tone, her voice devoid of the rage and pain that were churning within her. She owed them the truth, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. When she was finished, a heavy silence descended on the room. Her father, a man of few words, but deep integrity, looked stunned, his face ashen. Her mother was weeping silently, her hand over her mouth. I don't believe it," her mother whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Isabella would never, Julian would never." "But they did," Alara said, her voice firm. "And I have the proof." She had Catherine send over the evidence she had already gathered. Cell phone records, credit card statements that placed Julian and Isabella at hotels and restaurants over the past several months, even a private investigator's report that detailed their clandestine meetings. The truth was undeniable, a cold, hard mountain of facts that crushed any hope of a misunderstanding. Her parents were shattered. Their perfect family, their two beloved daughters, were now irrevocably broken. The days that followed were a blur of tearful phone calls, of their desperate attempts to mediate, to find some way to piece their family back together. "She's sorry, Alara," her mother had pleaded during one call. "She's truly, truly sorry. She wants to talk to you to beg for your forgiveness." "Forgiveness is not something she's entitled to," Alara had replied, her voice cold. Some things can't be fixed, Mom. This is one of them. The final devastating blow came a few weeks later. Catherine called, her voice grim. Elara, I have some news, and I don't think you're going to like it. What is it? Elara asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Isabella is pregnant, Catherine said, her voice soft. The words hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. She sank into a nearby chair, the phone slipping from her hand. Pregnant. Her sister was pregnant with her husband's child. The betrayal was no longer just a single act of infidelity. It was a living, breathing thing, a life that would forever intertwine her sister and her husband, a constant, painful reminder of their deceit. That night, for the first time since Liam was born, Elara broke down. After she put her son to bed, she retreated to her own room, the vast, empty space, a reflection of her own hollowed-out heart. She curled up on the bed and wept great, shuddering sobs that racked her entire body. She cried for her broken marriage, for her lost sister, for the innocent baby who would be born into this mess. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was just a raw, empty shell. But as the first rays of dawn began to stream through the window, a strange sense of clarity washed over her. The worst had happened. The ultimate betrayal had been revealed, and she was still standing. She got out of bed and went to the nursery. Liam was stirring, his little fists waving in the air. She picked him up, his warm, solid weight, a comfort in her arms. She looked down at his face, so peaceful, so innocent, and she made a silent vow. She would not let this destroy her. She would not let them win. She walked over to the window and looked out at the city now bathed in the soft morning light. A new day was dawning, and with it, a new resolve. The next morning, she called Catherine. I want to sell the house, she said, her voice firm. And I want to move, far away from here. Are you sure? Catherine asked, her voice gentle. I'm sure, Elara said. I need a fresh start, for me and for Liam, a place where we're not constantly reminded of what we've lost, a place where we can build something new. It was a terrifying prospect, leaving behind everything she had ever known. But it was also exhilarating. It was a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of her life. The fight was far from over. There were still legal battles to be won, emotional wounds to be healed. But for the first time since that fateful night at Serafina's, Elara felt a flicker of hope. She had lost a husband, a sister, a life she thought she wanted. But she had found something far more valuable, her own strength, her own resilience, and a love for her son that was more powerful than any betrayal. She was Elara Vance, and she was a survivor, and her new life was just beginning. 6 months later, the relentless California sun was a distant memory, replaced by the crisp, clean air of the Pacific Northwest. Elara had found a new home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Seattle, a charming craftsman house with a sprawling backyard and a view of the Puget Sound. The Bel Air mansion, with its ghosts and its grandeur, had been sold, its proceeds funding her new, simpler life. The divorce had been finalized, a brutal, drawn-out affair that had left her emotionally drained but financially secure. Catherine, true to her word, had been a warrior securing a settlement that was far more than Julian had initially offered. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. It was the price of his betrayal. She had heard through the sterile filter of her lawyers that Isabella had given birth to a daughter. Julian, stripped of his carefully curated image of the perfect family man, had retreated from the public eye, his billion-dollar empire now tainted by the scandal. He and Isabella were together, a fact that still sent a shard of ice through Ilara's heart. But the pain was duller now, a scar rather than an open wound. She had cut off all contact with her parents. Their inability to fully condemn Isabella's actions, their desperate pleas for a reconciliation she could never give, had created a chasm between them that felt impossible to bridge. It was a profound, aching loss, but one she had to endure to protect her own fragile peace. Her world was small now, but it was real. It was filled with the simple, profound joys of motherhood. Liam, now a giggling, curious baby, was the sun around which her universe revolved. His first smile, his first laugh, the way he curled his tiny hand around her finger. These were the moments that mattered, the moments that were slowly, painstakingly healing her broken heart. She had found a new community in her neighborhood, a group of other young mothers who met in the park for playdates and coffee. They didn't know her story, and she didn't offer it. To them, she was just Ilara, Liam's mom. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. One sunny afternoon, as she pushed Liam on a swing in the park, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know you hate me," it read, "and you have every right to. But I want you to know that I'm sorry, and that I miss my sister." It was from Isabella. Ilara stared at the message for a long moment, a swirl of conflicting emotions rising within her. There was anger, yes, but there was also a flicker of something else, a deep primal ache for the sister she had lost. She didn't reply. She wasn't ready. Maybe she never would be. But as she looked at Liam, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy as he soared through the air, she realized that forgiveness wasn't the goal. The goal was peace, and she was finally slowly finding it. She put her phone away and focused on her son, on the warmth of the sun, on her face, on the gentle rhythm of the swing. Her old life was gone, a casualty of a lie, a casualty of a business dinner. But in its place, a new life had taken root, a life that was smaller, quieter, but infinitely more precious. It was a life built not on wealth or status, but on the enduring, unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. And in that, Ilara had found a richness that all of Julian's millions could never buy. Ilara's story is a raw, powerful reminder that the deepest betrayals often come from those we trust the most. She lost a husband and a sister in one devastating blow, but in the ashes of that heartbreak, she found her own incredible strength and the fierce, unconditional love of a mother. Her journey from a gilded cage to a life of authentic joy is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. What would you have done in her shoes? How do you think she should have handled the final text from her sister? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories of love loss and the incredible power of new beginnings. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. Thank you for listening.